The silence in the Curry family's living room in Charlotte was so dense that you could feel the weight of decades of unspoken words hovering in the air like an emotional fog that was finally about to dissipate. Dell Curry was sitting in his favorite armchair, that same chair where he had watched countless Steph games over the years. But on this Saturday night, his hands trembled slightly as he turned a cup of cold coffee between his fingers. It was almost 11 at night, and the house was quiet, except for the rhythmic tick-tock of the wall clock that had marked the time of so many important family moments. Isha had put the children to bed an hour ago, and Sonia was in the kitchen, giving space for the two most important men in her life to have a conversation that she knew had been coming for years. "Dad," Steph said softly, sitting on the sofa across from Dell, "are you okay? You seem different today. Worried." Dell looked up and met his son's gaze. Those same eyes that he had seen grow from curious and innocent to determined and focused, and now mature and full of a wisdom that came from years of triumphs and challenges. It was impossible to look at Steph and not see the little boy who used to imitate his basketball moves in the garage, the teenager who came to him with tears in his eyes after rejections, the young man who had exceeded all expectations. "Steph," Dell began, his voice carrying a texture that Steph had rarely heard. Vulnerable, hesitant, loaded with years of repressed thoughts. "There's something I need to tell you, something I should have said a long time ago, but never had the courage. You can perceive that there are moments in a family's life when time seems to stop, when everyone instinctively knows that something important is about to happen, something that will forever change the dynamic between people who love each other deeply but have carried silent wounds for years." Steph leaned forward, his expression changing from casual curiosity to total attention. He knew his father better than anyone in the world, and there was something in Dell's tone, in the way his shoulders were tense, that suggested this would not be an ordinary conversation about basketball or family. "Dad, you can tell me anything," Steph said, his voice carrying that characteristic gentleness that had won millions of fans around the world. "We've been through so much together. What could be so difficult?" Dell closed his eyes for a moment, as if he were gathering strength from somewhere deep within himself. When he opened them again, there were tears forming, something Steph had seen maybe 3 times in his entire life. "Steph," Dell said, his voice breaking slightly, "I made mistakes as your father. Mistakes that haunt me every day. Mistakes that affected you in ways I only began to understand when it was too late to change them." The confession hung in the air between them like a fragile bridge between present and past. Steph felt his heart accelerate, not from anxiety, but from a complex mixture of surprise and compassion at seeing his father, his childhood hero, his model of strength and determination, so vulnerable and human. "Dad," Steph said gently, "you were an incredible father. You taught me everything about hard work, about perseverance, about—" "No," Dell interrupted, shaking his head with deep sadness. "Don't make it easier than it should be, son. I need to say this. I need to take responsibility for the times I failed you, for the words I said that hurt you, for the moments when I should have been your biggest supporter, but was your biggest critic." Steph felt a knot form in his throat. He had suspected that this conversation would eventually happen, but nothing could have prepared him to see his father emotionally falling apart before his eyes. "Do you know how difficult it is for me to admit that I, who played in the NBA for 16 years, who dedicated my life to basketball, failed to be the father you needed in the most important moments?" Dell asked, tears now flowing freely down his face. that I was so worried about preparing you for reality that I forgot to simply believe in you? How is it possible that a man who dedicated his life to being strong can find even more strength through vulnerability? Steph was witnessing something he knew few children have the privilege of experiencing. A father brave enough to recognize his failures and take responsibility for them. "Dad," Steph said, his own voice beginning to tremble, "Tell me. Tell me everything. It's long overdue for us to have this conversation." Dell took a deep breath, as if he were preparing to dive into deep waters that he had avoided for decades. "Steph, do you remember when you were 14 years old and weren't selected for the varsity high school team?" The question hit Steph like a punch to the stomach. Of course he remembered. It had been one of the most devastating moments of his adolescence, a high moment that had shaped his determination, but also left scars that he carried to this day. "I remember," Steph said simply. "You came home that night crying," Dell continued, "and instead of consoling you, instead of telling you that the coach was an idiot who didn't know how to recognize talent, do you know what I said?" Steph shook his head, not trusting his voice. "I said, 'Son, maybe it's a sign that you need to consider other sports. Maybe basketball just isn't for you. Maybe you're too small, too weak to compete at this level.'" Dell paused, letting the weight of those words settle. "I said that to my own son, at the moment when he most needed me to believe in him." The silence that followed was deafening. Steph felt as if he had been transported back to that terrible night at 14 years old, when his father's words had cut deeper than any coach's rejection could have cut. "Dad," Steph began, but Dell raised his hand. "Let me finish," Dell said, "because that was just the beginning. There's much more I need to confess. You can feel that sometimes the deepest wounds we carry don't come from strangers or enemies, but from the people we love most, from the people whose opinions matter more than anything else in the world. And sometimes true healing can only begin when those wounds are finally acknowledged and treated with the care they deserve." "Throughout your adolescence," Dell continued, "every time you came to me excited about a game you had played well, every time you shared your dreams of playing in college, of maybe one day reaching the NBA, do you know what my first reaction was?" Steph shook his head, tears beginning to form in his own eyes as he anticipated words that had probably shaped his psyche in ways he had never completely understood. "My first reaction was to find flaws," Dell admitted, his voice loaded with a shame he had carried for decades. "Instead of celebrating your achievements, I immediately pointed out what you had done wrong, what you needed to improve, why you shouldn't get too excited." The brutal honesty of this confession hit Steph like an emotional avalanche. How many times during his adolescence had he come home excited about a victory, only to have his enthusiasm diminished by his father's constant criticism? "I thought I was protecting you," Dell continued, now sobbing openly. "I thought that if I didn't let you dream too high, you wouldn't be devastated when you were rejected. I thought my job as a father was to prepare you for life's difficulties, not to feed hopes that could be crushed." "But I was wrong," Dell said, looking directly into Steph's eyes. "I was completely, devastatingly wrong. My job as your father wasn't to protect you from the possibility of failure. My job was to give you the confidence and support to face any failure and keep trying." Steph felt tears beginning to roll down his face as decades of family dynamics began to make sense in a completely new way. It wasn't that Dell didn't love him or didn't believe in him. It was that Dell had chosen to express his love through constructive criticism that had become destructive. "Dad," Steph said, his voice barely able to come out through the emotion. "Why didn't you ever tell me this before?" "Because I was too proud," Dell admitted. "Because admitting that I had failed as a father meant admitting that maybe everything I thought I knew about raising children was wrong. And because the more successful you became, the harder it became to admit that you had achieved everything despite my parenting, not because of it." The revelation that Steph had reached his greatness despite and not because of Dell's approach as a father created a moment of profound silence between them. It was a truth so painful and at the same time so liberating that both needed a moment to process it completely. "But there's one specific thing," Dell said, clearly preparing for the most difficult confession of all. "One thing I said to you that haunts me more than any other. And if I don't tell you this now, I'm going to die carrying this regret." Steph prepared himself emotionally, knowing that whatever his father was about to reveal would be devastating not only for both of them, but for anyone who eventually heard this conversation. Great truths about family relationships often emerge not through moments of celebration, but through courageous conversations where decades of unhealthy patterns are finally recognized, where wounds are exposed so they can be healed, and where unconditional love is redefined through mutual vulnerability and forgiveness. Dell Curry took a deep breath, as if he were preparing to dive into the deepest and darkest waters of his own consciousness. Places where he had buried memories that had tormented him for years, but that he had never had the courage to unearth and examine under the light of brutal honesty. "Steph," Dell began, his voice trembling like a leaf in a storm, "do you remember the summer before your senior year in high school? When you were being recruited by some small colleges, but none of the big universities were really interested?" Steph nodded slowly, feeling his stomach tighten with anticipation of what was coming. That had been one of the most frustrating summers of his young life, full of silent rejections and opportunities that never materialized. "You were working so hard that summer," Dell continued, tears renewing in his eyes. "Getting up at 5 in the morning to train, spending hours in the gym, studying videos of college players, doing everything you could to improve your chances. You can perceive that sometimes the most painful memories are those that involve moments when we were most vulnerable, when we were giving everything of ourselves to reach a dream that seemed impossible to everyone around us. And I remember one specific night," Dell said, his voice breaking, "a night in July when you came to me after another day of intense training. You were sweaty, exhausted, but your eyes were shining with hope." Steph closed his eyes, able to visualize exactly the moment his father was describing. He could feel again the tiredness in his muscles, the determination burning in his chest, the desperate hope that all his hard work would eventually be recognized. "You told me," Dell continued, each word coming out as if it were being torn from his soul. "Dad, I know I can play at the college level. I know I can. I just need a chance to show someone what I can do." The memory of those words, said with such youthful conviction, such pure faith in his own potential, made fresh tears roll down Steph's face. He remembered the intensity of that emotion, the desperate need for validation from his father. "And do you know what I answered?" Dell asked, his voice now barely above a tortured whisper. "Do you know what words came out of my mouth when my son came to me asking for nothing but faith and encouragement?" Steffi shook his head, unable to form words through the knot in his throat. "I said," Dell confessed, each word coming out like a confession of crime, "Steph, maybe it's time for you to be realistic about your limitations. You're a good high school player, but the college level is different. Those guys are bigger, stronger, faster than you. Maybe you should focus on getting an academic scholarship instead of continuing to chase this basketball dream." The silence that followed this revelation was so profound that it seemed to have physical substance, filling the space between father and son with decades of repressed pain that was finally being acknowledged. "Dad," Steph said, his voice broken by emotion, "I remember that conversation. I remember how I felt when you said that." "How did you feel?" Dell asked, although he clearly feared the answer. "Like my own father didn't believe in me," Steph answered, tears now flowing freely. "Like the only person in the world whose opinion really mattered to me thought I wasn't good enough for my own dreams." Dell doubled over as if he had taken a punch to the stomach, sobbing openly now. "Steph, I'm sorry. I'm sorrier than you'll ever know. Those words came out of my mouth, but they didn't represent my heart. They represented my fear. How is it possible that a father's love can be so distorted by fear that it transforms into something that hurts instead of heals?" Steph was beginning to understand that his father's critical words didn't come from lack of love, but from an unhealthy way of trying to protect him from disillusionment. "What kind of fear?" Steph asked gently, his voice carrying not anger, but genuine curiosity about his father's motivations. "The fear of seeing you broken," Dell explained. "Steph, I had seen so many young players throughout my career. Talented young people who had big dreams, but were crushed by the brutal realities of competitive basketball. I saw you working so hard, dreaming so big, and I was terrified that you would go through the same kind of devastation." Dell paused, wiping tears from his eyes. "But what I didn't realize at the time is that by trying to protect you from the possibility of failure, I was guaranteeing that you would face that failure without the confidence and support that comes from knowing your father believes in you unconditionally." The depth of this understanding, that misdirected protection can be more harmful than honest vulnerability, created a moment of mutual recognition between father and son about the complexities of paternal love. "But there's more," Dell said, preparing for an even more difficult confession. "Because even after you got a scholarship to Davidson, even after you started to excel there, I continued to find ways to diminish your achievements." Steph felt his heart accelerate again. The years at Davidson had been some of the happiest of his life. Years when he had finally found a coach who believed in him, teammates who respected him, and success that seemed to validate all his years of hard work. "Do you remember your game against Gonzaga in the NCAA tournament?" Dell asked. "When you scored 30 points and took Davidson to the Elite Eight?" "Of course I remember," Steph said. "It was one of the best games of my college life." "You called me that night," Dell continued, completely euphoric. "You said, 'Dad, did you see the game? Did you see what I did? Maybe I really have a chance in the NBA.'" The memory of that call came back to Steph like a wave. The pure joy he had felt, the desperate need to share this moment with his father, the hope that finally Dell would see his potential. "And instead of celebrating with you," Dell admitted, "instead of saying I was proud, that you had proven you could compete against anyone, do you know what I said?" Steph shook his head, although part of him suspected he knew exactly where this confession was going. "I said," Dell revealed, "I said, don't get too excited, Steph. It was just one game. The NBA is a completely different level. Those guys are professionals who have been doing this for years. You need to have realistic expectations about your chances." The casual cruelty of this response, reducing one of the most triumphant moments of Steph's college career to just one game, hit both men with renewed force. "Why, Dad?" Steph asked, his voice loaded with pain that had been buried for years. "Why couldn't you just be happy for me? Why did every achievement have to come with a warning?" "Because I was projecting my own insecurity onto you," Dell admitted with brutal honesty. "Steph, my NBA career was good, but it wasn't spectacular. I always felt like I was proving I belonged there. And when I saw you dreaming about the same world that had given me so much stress and anxiety, I was trying to spare you the same struggle." Dell paused, looking directly into Steph's eyes. "But what I didn't realize is that you weren't me. You had talents I never had, a mentality I never developed, a potential I was too blind to see because I was too busy projecting my own limitations onto you." The revelation that Dell had been limiting Steph based on his own insecurities created a new layer of understanding about decades of family dynamics. It wasn't that Dell didn't see Steph's talent. It was that he couldn't imagine Steph could overcome the limitations he himself had experienced. "And the worst part," Dell continued, "is that even after you were selected in the draft, even after you started to excel with the Warriors, I continued to find ways to criticize you instead of simply celebrating your success." Steph thought about countless phone conversations throughout his early NBA years, conversations where he had called to share victories and achievements, only to hear Dell point out areas where he needed to improve, or warnings about not becoming complacent. "Dad," Steph said, "I just wanted you to be proud of me. I just wanted to hear you say that I had made it, that I had proven you were wrong about my limitations." "But I was proud," Dell said desperately. "Steph, I was always incredibly proud of you. I bragged to anyone who would listen about my son who was playing in the NBA. But when it came to talking directly to you, I simply couldn't express it." How is it possible that pride can coexist with the inability to express that pride to the person who most needs to hear it? Steph was beginning to understand that his father had been struggling with his own emotional limitations, his own unhealed wounds from a career that had left invisible scars. "Why not?" Steph asked. "Why couldn't you just tell me you were proud?" "Because," Dell said, preparing for the most devastating confession of all, "because there was a part of me that was jealous, a part of me that was resentful, because you were reaching heights I had never reached, and instead of feeling happy for you, I felt diminished by your success." The brutal honesty of this admission created a silence so profound that both men could hear their own hearts beating. It was a confession that few fathers would have the courage to make, that their son's success had awakened not just pride, but also envy. Great truths about family relationships sometimes require that we recognize not just our failures as parents or children, but also our darkest impulses, our deepest insecurities, and our capacity to let our own fears and limitations prevent our ability to love and support unconditionally the people who matter most to us. The weight of Dell's last confession hung in the air between them like a truth so devastating that both men needed a moment to fully process what had been said. Steph felt as if he were seeing his father, his childhood hero, his model of masculinity and strength, through a completely new lens, a lens that revealed vulnerabilities and wounds he had never imagined existed. "Dad," Steph said softly, his voice loaded with compassion that transcended his own pain. "Thank you for telling me this. Thank you for being honest about something that must have been incredibly difficult to admit." Dell looked at Steph with a mixture of gratitude and amazement. "You're not angry with me? After everything I just confessed? After admitting that I was jealous of my own son?" "Dad," Steph responded, fresh tears forming in his eyes, "my heart is broken. Not for you, but for both of us. For all the years we spent carrying this pain in silence, for all the conversations we could have had if you had felt safe to be vulnerable with me before. You can feel that sometimes the moments of greatest healing in relationships don't come when forgiveness is offered, but when two people finally feel safe to be completely honest with each other about their deepest wounds, fears, and limitations. But there's more, Dell said, his voice trembling with emotion that suggested he was approaching the core of everything he had carried for years. Steph, there's one specific thing I said to you that haunts me more than any other. And if I don't tell you this now, if I don't take full responsibility for it, I'm going to die, knowing I was never completely honest with you. Steph prepared himself emotionally, intuiting that whatever his father was about to reveal would be devastating not just for both of them, but would represent the lowest moment in their relationship. Do you remember the night before your first NBA finals game? Dell asked, his voice barely able to come out through the emotion. When you called me and said you were nervous, that you just wanted to hear my voice before the biggest game of your career up to that point? Steph nodded slowly. He remembered that call vividly. It had been one of the most vulnerable moments of his professional career, when he had reached out to his father looking not for technical advice, but simply for unconditional love and support. I remember, Steph said. I was in my hotel room, and I was scared. Not of the game itself, but of the possibility of failing on the biggest stage. And I called you because you were the only person I wanted to hear before going to sleep. Dell doubled over, placing his face in his hands as if he couldn't bear to look at Steph while revealing what he was about to say. You told me, Dell began, his voice muffled by his hands. Dad, I know you always said to have realistic expectations, but tomorrow I'm going to be playing in the NBA Finals. This is real. I made it, and I just wanted to hear you say you're proud of me. The memory of that vulnerability, of an adult man simply asking to hear that his father was proud of him, created a moment of silence loaded with all the emotional history between them. And do you know what I answered? Dell asked, lifting his face, tears streaming like rivers of regret. Do you know what words I chose to say to my son on the eve of the most important game of his career? Steph shook his head, although part of him suspected he knew exactly where this confession was going, and the anticipation was creating physical pain in his chest. I said, Dell revealed, each word coming out as if he were confessing a crime, Steph, don't forget that reaching the finals doesn't mean anything if you don't win. Many players reach the finals and are remembered as failures. Don't let this go to your head until you actually prove you can win when it matters. The silence that followed this revelation was so complete and devastating that it seemed to suck all the oxygen out of the room. Steph felt as if he had been punched in the stomach, not just from the casual cruelty of those words, but from the memory of how they had affected his mental state on that crucial night. Dad, Steph said, his voice almost inaudible, I remember how I felt after that conversation. Tell me, Dell asked, although he clearly feared the answer. I hung up the phone and cried, Steph confessed. I cried because all I wanted was to hear my father say he was proud of me, and instead I heard that my achievement meant nothing unless I proved even more. Dell sobbed openly now, the weight of his own accidental cruelty crushing him like an emotional avalanche. Steph, I'm sorry. I'm sorrier than any words can express. I took the moment when you were most vulnerable, most needing support, and I turned it into another opportunity to criticize you. How is it possible that love can be so distorted by fear and insecurity that it transforms into something that hurts instead of heels? Steph was beginning to understand that his father had been operating from a place of his own unhealed wounds, his own perceived inadequacies. But the worst part, Dell continued, is that night, after hanging up the phone, I immediately knew I had said the wrong thing. I sat on my bed and thought, what the hell is wrong with me? Why can't I simply tell my son I'm proud of him? Steph felt his heart break, not just for his own pain, but for the anguish his father had carried in silence all these years. Why didn't you call me back? Why didn't you correct it? Because I was too proud, Dell admitted. Because admitting I had said the wrong thing meant admitting I was being a terrible father at the moment you needed me most. And the more time passed, the harder it became to fix it. Dell looked directly into Steph's eyes, his next words carrying the weight of decades of regret. Steph, you won that championship despite me, not because of me. You found strength within yourself that I should have been nurturing, but that instead I was constantly questioning. The admission that Steph had achieved his greatness despite, and not because of, his father's words created a moment of profound recognition about resilience, about the capacity to find inner strength even when external support fails. And there's one last thing, Dell said, clearly preparing for the most devastating confession of all. Something I've never said out loud to anyone, not even your mother, but that eats at me inside every day. Steph leaned forward, feeling he was about to hear the core of all the pain his father had carried. After you won your first MVP, Dell began, after it became clear to the entire world that you weren't just a good player, but one of the best of all time, I sat alone in my office and cried. Steph frowned, confused. You cried because you were emotional? No, Dell said, shaking his head. I cried because I realized I had lost years of your life doubting you. I cried because I understood that while the entire world was celebrating your greatness, I had spent decades trying to diminish it. Dell paused, gathering strength for the final confession. And then I realized the most devastating truth of all. What truth? Steph asked gently. That you had become an extraordinary man, not because of my parenting, but despite it. Dell revealed that all your strength, all your determination, all your ability to overcome obstacles, you developed that alone, while I was busy being one more obstacle instead of being your biggest supporter. The weight of this realization created a silence so profound that both men could hear their own hearts beating. It was a truth that redefined not just their father-son relationship, but Dell's very understanding of his role in Steph's life. And do you know what the most cruel irony of all is? Dell asked, looking at Steph with a mixture of admiration and anguish. You became not just a better player than I ever was, but a better man than I ever was. You treat your wife with a kindness that took me decades to learn. You treat your children with an encouragement I never managed to give you. You broke the cycle I perpetuated. Steph felt fresh tears forming in his eyes, but this time they weren't tears of pain. They were tears of recognition, of understanding, of deep compassion for a father who had struggled with his own limitations and finally found courage to face them. Dad, Steph said, his voice loaded with emotion that transcended decades of pain. There's something I need to tell you now, something that might change how you see all of this. Dell looked at Steph with expectation mixed with apprehension, preparing to hear how his confessions had affected his son. Great moments of healing in family relationships often require not just that one person finds courage to confess their failures, but that the other person finds courage to respond with a grace that can redeem years of pain and transform wounds into bridges of deeper understanding. Steph Curry looked at his father, this man who had been simultaneously his inspiration and his source of deepest pain for decades, and felt something fundamental changing in his heart. It wasn't anger being released, not even pain, but a deep understanding that both had been prisoners of patterns that neither had consciously chosen. "Dad," Steph began, his voice carrying wisdom that came from years of therapy, from conversations with Isha, from his own journey as a father who was determined to break negative cycles. "There's something I need you to understand about everything you just confessed." Dell looked at Steph with a mixture of hope and apprehension, clearly prepared for any response. Anger, disappointment, or perhaps worse, indifference. "Every critical word you said," Steph continued, "every moment you doubted me, every time you minimized my achievements, all of that really hurt me. It hurt deeply. But do you know what hurt me most?" Dell shook his head, tears forming again in his eyes. "What hurt me most was realizing that you were hurting too," Steph revealed. "Dad, even as a child, I could see that something inside you was broken. I could feel that when you criticized me, you were fighting against something within yourself. You can perceive that sometimes the greatest wisdom comes from being able to see beyond the pain that was caused to us to understand the pain of the person who hurt us, finding compassion even in the midst of the wound." "Steph," Dell said, his voice barely able to come out through the emotion, "you shouldn't have had to understand my pain. You were a child. It was my job to protect you from my emotional baggage, not make you carry the weight of it." "You're right," Steph agreed. "But Dad, I'm not telling you this to make you feel better about your choices. I'm telling you because I want you to understand something important about who I became." Steph leaned forward, looking directly into his father's eyes. "All my determination, all my ability to persevere through criticism and doubt, all my skill at using negativity as fuel, all of that was developed because I learned early that even the people who love us sometimes can't give us the support we need." Dell frowned, trying to process where this revelation was going. "And do you know what that taught me?" Steph asked. "It taught me that I had to find my own source of confidence, my own internal validation. It taught me that I couldn't depend on anyone's approval, not even yours, to know my own worth." The profound irony of this realization, that Dell's criticism had inadvertently forged exactly the mentality Steph needed to become extraordinary, created a moment of silent recognition between them. "So, in a strange sense," Steph continued, "you gave me exactly what I needed to succeed. Not in the way you intended, not in a healthy way, but you forced me to develop an inner strength I might never have found if you had been the constantly encouraging father I thought I wanted." Dell began to cry again, but this time his tears carried a complex mixture of relief, gratitude, and renewed understanding of how life can transform even our most painful mistakes into something that serves a greater purpose. "But there's more," Steph said. "Dad, do you want to know what moment really changed me as a person?" Dell nodded, completely absorbed in his son's words. "It was when I became a father for the first time," Steph revealed. "When I held Riley in my arms for the first time and realized I had the power to be the kind of father you never managed to be for me. How is it possible that the greatest healing can come not from changing the past, but from using the painful lessons of the past to create a better future?" Steph was articulating wisdom that transcended his own situation and touched something universal about how we transform wounds into wisdom. In that moment, Steph continued, I didn't feel anger toward you. I felt gratitude, because your limitations as a father gave me crystal clarity about the kind of father I wanted to be. Dell looked at Steph with admiration that was almost reverent. And what kind of father did you decide to be? The father who says, I believe in you before you need to work harder, Steph replied. The boy, too, father who celebrates dreams before pointing out obstacles. The father who expresses pride unconditionally, not as a reward for achievements. Steph paused, allowing these words to settle. And do you know how I know I'm doing it right? Because when I look into my daughter's eyes, I see the same confidence I always wanted to see reflected in your eyes when I looked at you. The beauty of this statement, that Steph had transformed his own wound into a source of healing for the next generation, created a moment of profound silence and mutual recognition. But the most important thing I learned, Steph said, is that forgiveness isn't about forgetting or pretending the pain didn't happen. Forgiveness is about understanding that hurt people sometimes hurt other people, and choosing to break the cycle instead of perpetuating it. Dell looked at Steph as if he were seeing not just his son, but a teacher, a sage who had found a way to transform decades of pain into profound wisdom. Steph, Dell said, his voice trembling, can you forgive me? Not just for the words I said, but for all the years I was more of an obstacle in your life than a support? Steph got up from his chair and walked to where his father was sitting. He knelt beside Dell's armchair, looking directly into his eyes. Dad, Steph said, I don't just forgive you. I thank you. Why? Dell asked, genuinely confused. Because you gave me exactly the experiences I needed to become who I am today, Steph explained. Because you taught me that true strength comes from within, not from external validation. And because you showed me, through your limitations, exactly the kind of father I never want to be to my children. Steph placed a hand on his father's shoulder. But more important than all of that, you finally found courage to have this conversation. You finally chose vulnerability instead of pride. And that shows me it's never too late to grow, to change, to become the person you always wanted to be. Dell hugged Steph with an intensity that carried decades of repressed love, of unspoken words, of regrets that were finally being released. I love you, son, Dell said through tears. I always loved you, even when I couldn't show it the right way. I know, Dad, Steph replied. I always knew. And I love you too. They stayed embraced for several minutes, two men who had carried wounds for decades, finally finding healing through brutal honesty and unconditional forgiveness. Dad, Steph said, when they finally separated, can I ask you something? Anything, Dell replied. I want you to be the grandfather to my children that you couldn't be as a father to me, Steph said. I want you to encourage them unrestrainedly, to believe in their dreams unconditionally, to be the voice that says, you can do anything, instead of, be realistic about your limitations. Dell smiled through his tears. You would give me that chance? After everything I did wrong? Dad, Steph said. Second, chances aren't just about receiving forgiveness. They're about choosing to be different. And you already showed today that you're ready to be different. In that moment, Sonia appeared at the living room door, having heard fragments of the conversation. She looked at her husband and son, both with red eyes from crying, but both radiating a peace she hadn't seen between them in years. Are you two okay? She asked gently. We're better than okay, Steph replied, smiling at his mother. We finally had the conversation we should have had 20 years ago. Dell looked at his wife, then at his son, and felt something he hadn't experienced in decades. The sensation that it was possible to start over, that it's never too late to become the person you always wanted to be. "Sonia," Dell said, "Steph taught me something today. He taught me that our mistakes don't define us if we choose to learn from them. And he taught me that true love sometimes means having difficult conversations we should have had long ago." 3 months later, when Dell was watching his granddaughter Riley play basketball, he leaned over to her and said, "Riley, do you know that your grandfather believes you can do anything you dream of?" Riley smiled at him. "I know, Grandpa. Daddy always tells me that you learn to be the best grandfather in the world." And in that moment, Dell Curry knew he had finally found his redemption. Not through denying or minimizing his mistakes as a father, but through transforming them into wisdom that could benefit the next generation. Great truths about family relationships teach us that it's never too late to ask for forgiveness, that real healing requires brutal honesty about our failures, and that sometimes the greatest gift we can give to the people we love is our own transformation. Proving that people can change, grow, and become better versions of themselves when they find courage to face their own wounds with honesty and humility.